First of all, thanks everybody for joining this webinar. I'm Alicia Jensen, like you know, at Sierra Front Field Office, and I'm going to give an overview of sites within my district and around the district that are prominent sites. So there we go. I've been working at the Sierra Front Field Office since September 2014. And this slide shows where my district is here highlighted in orange. And the Sierra Front side that I work on is on the western side of the district. The Stillwater Field Office is on the east side of our district. And together, both field offices administer almost 4.8 million acres. And you can see the boundaries of the other BLM districts on this map. All the BLM land is noted in yellow, and I'm going to use yellow for BLM land throughout the presentation on the maps. So the first thing we're going to dive into is, when did people first arrive to the CCDO area? Before we get too far into that, I just want to talk about generally how people populated North America. So you're all probably familiar with the Bering Land Bridge that is mapped here. During the Ice Age, sea levels were a lot lower, and so this land bridge was exposed, and researchers theorized that human beings crossed this land bridge from Asia into North America to populate the continent. Recent geological data, though, shows that parts of the ice-free corridor were not open or habitable early enough for some of the dates that we have sites for in North America. So new evidence shows that earlier, people may have come by boat following the ancient coastlines. And both pathways are illustrated here on the map. The coastal route is in red. And we do not have sites this old in the Carson City district, but it is really important to talk about this new research that's come out from New Mexico at the White Sands National Park, because in this area, archaeologists and researchers have found these incredibly well-preserved human footprints. And that's what you're looking at right here. They're incredibly well-preserved. And they were also stratigraphically constrained between seed layers that were able to be dated to between 23,000 and 21,000 years ago. So this is a long time before the Clovis period began, and it's the earliest known date that we're aware of. So it's a very significant study. In our area, we know that the environment was a lot different during the Pleistocene. And this is a map of Pleistocene Lake Lahontan. This was a pluvial lake that would have reached its most recent high stand about 14,000 years ago. And it started to dry up around 13,000 years ago. And so you can see Lake Tahoe over here. Hopefully you can see my cursor, and the Carson River right here, and how it was part of this huge lake. And Humboldt's over here. Pyramid Lake is right on the edge of our district because it's on reservation land today. And Winnemucca Lake or subbasin would have been right next to Pyramid Lake, but this is all dry, like most of the area of the lake that you see on this map. So for the earliest periods in my district, you could imagine that there would have been very different resources during the Pleistocene, because there would have been so much more water, there would have been megafauna. And in our area during the Paleo-Indian period, that's started about 14,500 years ago, there is this very old petroglyph site that's found in the Winnemucca Lake subbasin that I just pointed out to you all. So it's near the Pyramid Lake area, east of Pyramid Lake. And these petroglyphs are incredibly unique for many reasons. You can see that they are deeply incised. And you also see cupules right here, which we do have cupules in my district, and we do have deeply incised petroglyphs, but it's not common to see them this deeply incised. And these are all on top of a tufa mound. And so that is important because these petroglyphs were able to be dated because researchers could date the tufas, and they could date the carbonate layer that coated some of the petroglyphs. And so by doing that, they got a date range that shows that the petroglyphs could have been carved anywhere from 14,800 years ago to 10,200 years ago. And so we don't have hardly any sites that have petroglyph sites that date this far back. And during the Paleo-Indian period, people would have been using Western STEM tradition projectile points. And I've got a picture down here underneath the petroglyphs. These tools are narrow and got sloping shoulders with thick contracting bases. And so they were probably inserted into socket halves, and they were probably used for thrusting, but may have also been projectiles, so like spears, right? During this time period, there is no evidence of seed processing like you would see ground stone. You wouldn't see that during this period. Although, like I said, there's not very many sites that date this far back. And populations were probably sparser here too. Other sites that date to this period regionally are like Paisley Caves in Oregon and the Manus Mastodon site in Washington. So here's a couple other examples of artifacts from this period. And then we get into the Clovis period, which is the hallmark of the Clovis period, of course, is the Clovis spear point. And I've got a picture of that in the middle of the screen. So these are fluted lanceolate points with a concave base. And in archaeology, they're often found with bifacial blanks, knives, and scrapers, or in isolated contexts. So that means that they're found by themselves. And the reason why this is so hard to find Clovis period sites is, you can miss a single artifact on the landscape when you're doing a survey pretty easily. So we don't have very many of these sites in our district. I have personally never seen a Clovis point while I've been doing inventory in my district, but they are out there. They're just not very common. And researchers have found that the fluted points in the Great Basin are smaller and they have a deeper indentation on their bases than Clovis points found in other parts of North America. And so that's why I have Western fluted in parentheses next to Clovis, because that's a term used for our area. So hunter-gatherers during this time would have subsisted on big game and also the many rich resources that would have been around those ancient lakes that I showed in the map earlier. And I included this projectile point type sequence that shows the Clovis point at the very bottom right and how our technology in the Great Basin has changed over time until you get to you got atlatl darts, and then you have arrowheads are the most recent form of technologies that were just, invented about 1,000 years ago. And I'm going to highlight some of these different types of points throughout these slides. So during the Paleoarchaic, which began 12,800 years ago, Clovis technologies phased out and the megafauna species became extinct. And I've got this photo here to show you what some of them look like. But the Western stem tradition is still being used, and Western stemmed goes for a long period of time. So as the climate is changing and the ancient lakes are drying up, people have to expand their diets to include more small mammals and fish, waterfowl, and vegetal foods, including seeds. So that's when you see evidence of groundstone appearing. And one of our sites on our district that dates to about this period is the Grimes Point archaeological area. This site, this archaeological area, because it's a large area, is located on the Stillwater Field Office near Fallon. And Native American people first came here anywhere from 8,000 to 9,000 years ago. And there are petroglyphs in this area. And this is a picture of one of them. They're carved on basalt boulders that have this black patina that is often called the desert varnish. And on the bottom is a photo of the inside of Hidden Cave. And this is another one of our really major sites on the district. It's a part of the Grimes Point area, and it is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. So the cave itself was formed around 21,000 years ago by the ancient lake Lahontan. And so the wave action would have been carving this cave out. And as the levels changed, sometimes the cave would have been flooded. Sometimes it would have been exposed to the air. And most of the time period that the cave existed, it was in use by animals, not humans. So there's a ton of data from Hidden Cave that tells us what animals and plants existed in this area throughout time. And that makes it really interesting by itself. But then about 3,800 years ago to 3,500 years ago, you see evidence of humans caching artifacts within this cave. And to cache means to store. So they're using the cave as storage. And the reason why archaeologists believe that is because they have put unbroken artifacts in concentrations in there. So like in a neat little pile, really nice artifacts. And they put them there in this cave because they thought they would be safe there and that they could come back and get those items back. And we have a really wonderful documentary about Hidden Cave. If you Google Hidden Cave documentary, you will get a link on YouTube. And I really recommend you watch it because it will expand a lot more on this archaeological area. We also do tours of Hidden Cave with Churchill County Museum. So if you Google Hidden Cave tour, you can get more information on how you can tour this area. This is a great site because it's interpreted to the public and you can visit there. And we have a brochure that's a visitor guide and map at BLM if you're ever in the area and want a copy. We stopped doing tours during COVID, but I think we're gonna start up again soon from the BLM side. So in the next slide. All right, so then you have the Post-Mazama period that started 7,600 years ago. And it's marked by the eruption of Mount Mazama, which happened around that time. And it spread ash and pumice all across North America. And so this is very important for archaeologists because when you have a well-preserved site with good stratigraphy, you can see the ash layer and you can know at what time the things in the other layers happen in relation to that layer. So in Hidden Cave, you can see the ash layer if you zoom in on those layers that are each marked. If I'm going to go back, because there's tags on all the different layers at Hidden Cave that show what the different levels represent, what they was found there and what time period. And you can see the ash layer there. I think it's right. It's the light colored one right here. So during this period, Western stem tradition points stopped being used in favor of the northern side notch, the large side notch, and Humboldt points. You're also going to find split stemmed and Elko points present during this time period. And here's a photo from a study in central Nevada. You're also going to find greater diversity in groundstone tools, and you're going to find them together in assemblages, the groundstone and the side notch points. So another really important environmental change was the spread of pinyon throughout the Great Basin. In this map, you will see the estimated late Pleistocene distribution of pinyon, which is in these diagonal lines. So it was a lot further south. And then the modern day distribution is this dashed line. And throughout Nevada, pinyon spread at different times. So in the Toquima Range, like in the center of Nevada, there's evidence of pinyon going back about 5,000 years ago. And the evidence that people are looking at is Neotoma middens, which is pack rat middens. And so in our area, we have the Pine Nut Mountains that is east of Lake Tahoe, north of this White Mountains that's in California area. And we did a study on the pine nuts, a historic context of the Pine Nut Mountains. And there is no well-established pinyon date for the Pine Nut Mountain Range. And it was actually absent in a midden that was dated from the Sunrise Pass area. But north of the Pine Nut Mountains, there is presence of pinyon about 1,000 years ago. So we don't know exactly when pinyon was within the Pine Nut Mountains. And that's somewhere where we want to learn more from research that we're going to do. You can see in the White Mountains, about 8,700 years ago, there was pinyon there. So, it could be a lot of different ranges, but I've got a map here that's this red arrow is kind of pointing to the middle of the Pine Nut Mountains, and everything yellow is BLM. So a lot of the Pine Nut Mountains is in yellow that we manage. And there's very interesting sites out here like pine nut caches, habitation sites, and it goes all the way to modern times because pine nut harvesting is still extremely important to local Native American people. Okay, and then during the Archaic period that started 5,700 years ago, there were a lot of different changes happening, and it's actually split up into 3 different periods within that period. So at the very beginning, you see small hunting camps and stone working sites with artifacts like split stem projectile points and large quantities of stone milling tools. In the Middle Archaic, you have intensified production of and trade of toolstone, increased trade of obsidian, greater presence of marine shell beads, and a lot more complexity in social organization and households. So the house pits tend to have like hearths and storage pits and burials during this time. And there's greater varieties of textiles. Rock art becomes more common and people are more sedentary. So I have a photo here of some rock art from our district, from the Archaic Basin Petroglyph Area of Critical Environmental Concern, or ACEC. And we do have stewards that steward sites in this area. So of course, I'm going to talk about that. So like I said earlier, it's really uncommon to have petroglyphs as old as those found near Pyramid Lake, but from this period, we do have a lot more. And that's where most of our petroglyphs and sites within the power range date to this time frame. And then the late Archaic is very important because this is where you have the invention of the bow and arrow that takes place of the atlatl and the darts technology. So you've got Rose Spring and Eastgate points. And let's see, plants and small animals are prioritized in local diets, and milling tools become more abundant. So if you think about all the pinyon that's spreading and how important the pinyon becomes in local native diets, of course, you're going to see more groundstone like you see on the bottom right of this slide. And these are some examples of points from this time period. Okay, so now we get to the Archaic Basin Petroglyph, ACEC. This is an area that is very important in the Sierra Front Field Office, and it's one of the areas I've visited the most. And I've done inventory in this area for our proactive inventory requirements. And like I was saying, we have data from radiocarbon dating, obsidian hydration readings, and the diagnostic projectile points to know that the earliest consistent occupation of this area was anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 years ago. And there are just hundreds, if not maybe thousands, of petroglyph panels in this area. And they have these two different styles represented within them. The Great Basin Abstract, which is further categorized as being curvilinear or rectilinear. And I'm going to show you examples of those. And the Great Basin Representational Style, which includes zoomorphs and anthropomorphs. And that means like animals or representations of humans. And on this picture, you can see a person right here. Hopefully you can see my cursor. And he's got a bow and arrow that is pointing at a bighorn sheep. And so while you can't date the surface of the rock, because this person is using a bow and arrow, you know that this must have been carved after the invention of bow and arrow. So probably not more than 1,000 years old. Anywhere from 1,000 to a few hundred years old is how you can kind of date a petroglyph panel like this, even though you may not be able to radiocarbon date it. So I think that's really great. Over here is another archer pointing at a bighorn sheep. And hopefully you can see the horns, and that's why we think it's a bighorn sheep. And then on this panel, you also see a dot within a circle. And this is an example of a Great Basin Abstract. Curvilinear includes circles and dots and wavy lines, while rectilinear is more about zigzags and straight lines and boxes and that kind of stuff. So during one of our inventories in this area, Rachel, my coworker, and I found these two rock rings that you see on the bottom left. And within those rock rings, we found lots of pieces of groundstone, but they weren't really near petroglyph panels. So sometimes you find petroglyphs associated with rock rings and groundstone out here, and sometimes you don't. We also found this basalt projectile point in the same area. Most of the sites in the Para ACEC date to pre-contact times, but you do find some historic artifacts. And we do know that, for example, sheep herding was happening in this area. And this is a picture of from one of the studies done in this area of some of the beads that were found within this area. And then I'm going to show you all the different petroglyphs photos that I've taken over my many visits to this area. The large photo on the top left is a photo of one of the sites that was originally recorded by Alvin McLean. So you may be familiar with Alvin McLean. He did a lot of work in the 90s in this area, and he has a very important report from, I think it's 1999, that some of you are probably familiar with. And he took a lot of points and put together a map of different areas in this region that have petroglyphs. But his points were not formally recorded on IMAX forms like we do today. And so one of the goals of our district is to go visit Alvin McLean points, find them, and get a site boundary. And so it was a really good day when we found this panel, because we weren't sure if it would be exactly where Alvin McLean said it would be, but we found it. And we did a big survey around this area, and I'm in the process of writing it up in a report. But the other petroglyphs you see here include this bird figure, the Goonie bird, I think, yes, on the bottom left, and an archer again pointing at the bird. And then in the bottom middle, you have more examples of curvilinear style. Circles within circles is a really common motif out here. And then we have two photos here of bighorn sheep from our area. And I always found this one with the really thick lines to be interesting because they're usually not that thick. Usually you see the kind in the bottom right a lot more often in this area. And then on the top right is an example of the dots and rectilinear and the lines up there on the top. Okay, and then the terminal prehistoric began about 600 years ago and went into contact times. So during this time period, you will find desert side notch points like the one you see a photo of down here. There's small triangular points with narrow notches near the slightly concave bases, which you can see. We also have cottonwood series points that are small and triangular, but they're unnotched. And during this time period, family groups were smaller and more dispersed, and they settled on previously unoccupied areas, and house construction becomes simpler than in earlier times, but people are still using large scale hunting features like corrals and that kind of thing. Both of the artifacts on this slide were found in an inventory that we did near the Pine Nut Mountains, because like I said, this is a very important area of research for us. And we did find a cottonwood point with the desert side notch point. So we know that it's from this time period. We also, that's a metate on the bottom left, and we found it in pieces, and the pieces fit together, which is, it's always nice when that happens. And at that site, we also found historic artifacts. And when you see historic artifacts co-occur with Native American artifacts from this time period, you start to think maybe this is an ethno-historic site. An ethno-historic site just basically means a Native American site during the historic time frame after contact. So the photo of the woman here using the bedrock mortar would be from this time period. This is a historic photo, but she's still, taking part in traditional Native American lifeways by using the bedrock mortar. And in the Pine Nut Mountains area, we know that there was a lot of use after the arrival of Pinyon. So yeah, we think that that site might have been more of a post-contact era site, but it's not always exactly obvious. If you were to find, for example, a flaked bottle glass, then you would know that Native Americans were using non-native materials for their traditional lifeways. Okay, and so I really want to explain the traditional tribal lands of the Native American people that live here today and that lived during some of the time periods I've already discussed. Oh, hold on, I gotta. Okay, sorry, I had to cough. So the Washoe, their traditional tribal lands centered on Lake Tahoe. You can see on this map, they went all the way up to Honey Lake and all the way down to Markleyville and Colville in California. And they have three different subgroups, with the Well-Melty being in the north and the Pawalu being in the valley in the center area near Carson City. And Hungalelti people lived in the south near Markleyville. And so their important food source were acorns, pine nuts, native fish, and plants and deer. And this map shows the different pathways that they would have taken throughout the different seasons to get what they needed to survive. And while their area is shown here kind of in the darker gray, it is not like a very firm boundary. People would go outside of their traditional tribal lands when they needed to. So you can see they went west into California for acorns, and they visited Pyramid Lake occasionally for fish. So, and that's true of all the Native people. You know, they would have traveled beyond their boundaries at least some of the time. Okay, here we go. So one of the most famous Washoe people is Datsulali, who is also known as Louisa Kaiser, and she was born in 1835. And she is famous for being an exceptional basket weaver. And these are some examples of her baskets. Some of her baskets are housed within the vault at the Nevada State Museum. And I actually did get to see them and baskets made by other people when I went on a tour led by Dr. Eugene Hattori. And they're just really incredible. And it could take months and even maybe years, I think, to make some of these. And after contact, people saw her incredible skill, non-native people, and then her baskets were actually sold around the world. So she's a very significant person in Washoe history. Okay, and then the other people that have traditional tribal lands in our district are the Northern Paiute. They also go by the Numu in their language. Their territory crosses California, Oregon, Nevada, and Idaho. And there are many different bands in this Northern Paiute territory. And a lot of them are named after significant food sources. So they're located east of the Washoe. And for example, you would see the Tuvusi Dakota near Yerington and Fort Churchill, and their name means grass bulb eaters. So a lot of these other people are named after what they like to eat in that region. And they would have also traveled seasonally like the Washoe. We know for sure that the Tuvusi Dakota also made use of the Pine Nut Mountains, but on the eastern side of the range, while the Washoe were on the western side of the range. And a very significant Northern Paiute person from our district is Wovoka, who is also known as Jack Wilson. And he was a prophet of the ghost dance. And this is a very significant dance that was started or repopularized around the late 19th century. And the dance was supposed to reunite living people with the spirits of the dead and return the world to pre-contact traditions. Because when non-Native people started to come to our area, it basically turned upside down the life of all the Native people that lived here by, for example, clear cutting the pine nut mountains and the pine nut trees to use the wood in mines and ranches, and polluting waters and hunting Native animals in the area. And it created incredible hardship for the people that lived here. And so this dance kind of wanted to turn back time so that we could go back to a time, they could go back to a time when they had their traditions alive. And so thousands of people participated in dances for days. They would dance for days. And the ghost dance was a phenomenon that spread across North America. So it wasn't just part of Nevada or our district, it spread far and wide. I do know that we've been told from other people that we consult with in Yerington that there were important dance areas in the Yerington area. And then the Western Shoshone are shown here, covering the southeastern California, central Nevada, and northwestern Utah. And so they speak varieties of Central Numic, and they have a lot of the similar food sources as the Northern Paiute and the Washoe people, but of course it would change depending on the area. And there's Southern Paiute in Southern Nevada. So Western Shoshone people would have lived probably more on the Stillwater field office side of our district. And let's see. And then we get into non-Native people. When did the first non-Native people come to our area? And the first non-Native people to our area were fur trappers, including Jedediah Strong Smith, who's got a portrait here. And he was from the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. There was a lot of competition in the fur trade. Everybody was looking for the best furs. And it turned out that our area is not that great for furs. Other areas are better. So there are not a lot of archaeological sites that you can directly associate with the fur trappers, the early fur trappers. And then you also have Joseph Walker here shown on the bottom right. And he first crossed the Great Basin in 1833 with 40 men. And so before the Bonneville Walker expedition, non-Native people were, had contact with Indigenous people, but usually it was just observing or cooperative. A lot of the routes that you're gonna see in these historic maps used to be, were used by Native Americans for a really long time. But during the Bonneville Walker expedition, there was violence between Euro-Americans and Indigenous people. And in one instance, that expedition resulted in the murder of 30 to 40 Native people. So this is obviously adding to the difficulties happening during post-contact times. And then you have John C. Fremont, who had 5 state-sponsored explorations that resulted in early scientific maps of Nevada and the Great Basin. And so his expeditions happened starting around 1843. And you can see all the different routes here on this map. You can see how they would have passed through Gardnerville area and other areas in and around our district. Okay, but then this large change happened with the start of the California Trail. So the first party that was successful in reaching Northern California by way of Humboldt River was the Bidwell-Bartleson Party in 1841. So between 1841 and 1860, over 200 immigrants traveled along the California Trail. And I've got a map on the background that shows all the different branches of the trail, because people had different destinations. They were traveling during different seasons, and that's why there's so many different routes, especially at the end of the trail. In our district, we have the Truckee route, Beckworth Trail, Carson route, the Sonora, and I'm going to show you some of these photos from segments of trail. I have recorded a segment of the Carson route near Silver Springs in Nevada, and that's the photo on the bottom left. So the Carson route actually became one of the most popular ways to get to California, because it avoided river crossings, and it avoided the Truckee Pass, which is also known as the Donner Pass, where the disaster of the Donner Party happened. So yeah, people didn't want to go that way as much anymore after the Donner Party. Wonder why, yeah. So this route was established by the Mormon Battalion. So sometimes it's called the Mormon route. And then on the bottom right, we have a photo of the Fernley Swales. And this is the only example of deep sand swales left by immigrant wagons on the California Trail. Beside the Fernley Swales, you also have the Central Pacific Railroad grade that goes parallel to the trail. And we do a cleanup at the Fernley Swales every year for National Public Lands Day. Yeah, so when the railroads started to be established, people stopped using these trails. And the railroads were beginning around 1868, 1869 with, you know, the Transcontinental, Central Pacific, and so on. And of course, all these immigrants were coming for gold. Another very important thing about our history is the mining sites and our mining landscapes. But of all these mining landscapes that we have on our district, I think the Virginia City National Historic Landmark is one of the most significant ones, and it is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. So immigrants were obviously on their way to California for gold, the 49ers in 1849 and so on. And while they were looking for gold in California, they explored other areas, including parts of Nevada and Gold Hill, and where Virginia City is today in Dayton. And the Comstock lode was discovered in this area, which caused the rush to Washoe after 1859. And following this discovery, there's a lot of booms and busts that happened within the Comstock Historic District area. You also had construction of the B&T Railroad and other railroads in the area to link communities together. Then you also had, in the early 1900s, technological shifts to using cyanide in mills to mill some tailings and low-grade ores that you couldn't mill profitably before. With new technology, people thought maybe we can get more silver and gold out of these areas. And then following that time period in the 1920s is when the Comstock merger mines built the American Flat Mill, which the site of which is on our district. And gold mines closed in the 1940s during the World War II era because the government asked everybody to just produce strategic minerals for the war effort. And that did not include silver and gold. So this map right here shows some of the sites within Virginia City. Virginia City is right here, if you can see my cursor. Gold Hill, Silver City, all of these triangle shapes represent shafts. And so there's tons of shafts and prospecting pits, mines, all within this area. This is a huge mining landscape. One of the innovations that came out of the Comstock area is the invention of square set timbering that occurred around 1860. And I've got a diagram here that shows what square set timbering looks like. And so one of the challenges that was faced in the Virginia City area is that the mines were really unstable when you go underground, and they were very, very dangerous. So the further you went down, the more dangerous it became. And so the square set timbering system allowed greater support for these areas to stabilize the mines. And this is a very important development. In the Virginia City area, you also had the Sutro Tunnel that was proposed by Adolf Sutro, who was a Prussian Jewish mining entrepreneur. And this development, his idea began around 1860 also. And the Sutro Tunnel is shown on this map, going from Virginia City about 6 miles southeast until it comes out north of Dayton. And the photo shows the entrance of the Sutro Tunnel. So all kinds of developments were happening in this area. Obviously the V&T Railroad also that I mentioned before. And this photo on the left shows a really good example of what Gold Hill would have looked like around 1866. All the historic buildings here and the mining landscape and the different industries that were happening. And then on the bottom right, you'll see a photo of Northern Paiutes playing cards in Virginia City. And so Native American people obviously didn't just disappear when non-Native people came. They tried to adapt to the environment changing around them. And so some Native people were working for ranches and some were living in and around Virginia City. And I've heard that there are Paiute Native American houses kind of on the periphery of Virginia City. I have not seen them in person, but they're fascinating because they're from the historic period. So they're using traditional house structures, but incorporating historic period materials. And then, as I mentioned earlier, American Flat Mill, what is on our district, it's demolished now, but it is located on the American Flat, of course. And it was conceived around like the late 19-teens, but actually finished construction in 1922. And it only lasted until 1926. So it was very short-lived because they found out that even using cyanide milling technology, they couldn't get enough profit out of the low-grade ores and tailings that they were trying to mill there. But the site is significant because it was one of the largest mills of its kind anywhere at the time. And the map on the right shows the positioning of the different buildings. There were 8 buildings, and the spurs of the railroad right here, 2 different spurs of the railroad that would have come in and left ore here to be milled. We also have a documentary for the American Flat Mill that you can look up on YouTube. There's a website too where you can do a virtual tour of the ruins. So on the bottom left is an example of what the ruins looked like before the structures were demolished. And it was a really neat area to visit. I visited there a few times before it was demolished, and I've worked on the mitigation projects for the American Flat Mill. So it kind of just represents the very last gasp of large-scale mining in the Comstock, Virginia City area. And there was a company town there too. That is really interesting. You can see it, a little bit of the structures in the background on this photo. And okay, and I think that's the end of my time. Yeah, I'm at the end. So there are many other sites in my district that are very interesting, but I kind of tried to show you some of the ones that, the ones that are listed on the National Register, the ones that I have a personal interest in. And I have a personal interest in the Pine Mountains area, the Para, Petroglyph, ACEC, and I always enjoy reading the new research that comes out of the Virginia City area.